Hello, everybody. My name is Valerie Julliand. I'm the United Nations Resident Coordinator in Indonesia, and I'm very happy to be here with you. And I wish you all a very happy International Youth Day. I'm glad to celebrate this day with you, and I'm also very happy to have the opportunity to answer all your questions. Let's start.
Hi, Miss Valerie. It's Ayesha here. I wanted to ask you a question. What does the UN plan to do to help achieve educational equity in Indonesia to ensure that every student has the opportunity, resources, and support to succeed in school despite of their socio-economic backgrounds? Thank you.
Hi, Aisha. Well, that is a very interesting question that you raise. And what I want to say is that educational equity cannot be achieved if there isn't equity in the other sectors. You need gender equity, you need work equity, you need social equity in order to have educational equity, because it cannot work in isolation over the sector. And simply because equity is a state of mind, it's a political orientation of a government and society. And actually, if you look at it, countries with the greater educational equity are as well the countries with the greater gender equity, with strong social protection policies, with inclusive economy, with democratic governance, and with rule of law. So all this is so much interlinked. So you can't hope to have educational equity if all the other sectors aren't as well with an equitable approach. So let me give you an example. Despite the fact that you have had an increase in the enrollment of children at school, and there has been quite a big progress over the past decade, there are about more than 4 million children between the age of 7 and the age of 18 that are actually out of school in Indonesia. And the main reason is actually the socioeconomic and the geographical disparity. So you see how much these two are interlinked. And what we realize is that the adolescent of junior secondary school age from the poorest households are 5 times more likely to be out of school than those coming from the wealthiest households. So once again, economic inequality and inequity leads to school inequity. Take another example. The junior secondary school children rate among children is actually about 1% in Rio province and 22% in the Papua province, geographic inequity. Now take another example. 1/3 of the adolescents with disability are out of school. Some of them have never set foot even in school. And I must say this rate is for the junior secondary level. And if you look at the the primary level, and if you look at the secondary level, it goes to 62%. That's another form of social inequity that translates into educational inequity. And these inequalities and inequities also show not only in schooling, but also in the outcome, learning outcomes. And what we see is that the students with the highest economic status are almost 3 times more likely to achieve a minimum proficiency in reading than those who are coming from the lowest socioeconomic status. And the same for the children from Papua, Maluku, Sulawesi, and Nusa Tenggara. They will also consistently perform lower than the national average. So what we do as UN is that we work very closely with the government and other entities, and we work at central and local level. And we do different things. First, we work on the registration of children at birth, because this is the determinant of access to school. If a child is registered, that child can be tracked and monitored for his or her enrollment at school. And we also work with the Ministry of Villages, for instance, at local level, to make sure that within the communities, there is a system of tracking of children who are out of school so that they can be supported. And we have also supported the government in developing a national strategy on out-of-school children so that we can provide guidance to government on how to implement programs that will address those situations. Now, there is another component of that, is that we also work on the non-formal education system through the community learning centers, because this is a fantastic alternative for the learning pathway of those children that are out of school. And it is more flexible. It is based on needs. Now, there is also another aspect. When you want to have educational equity, you need to have teachers that are well-trained, that are capacitated, and you have to have a good school management, especially in remote and rural areas, let's say, such as Papua, for instance, or South Sulawesi. So we work on this as well. So as you can see, as UN, we really promote an inclusive education with a focus on children and adolescents with disability as well. And finally, we also work on the digital divide, because nowadays, everything goes digital, including education. So we have to make sure that children are equipped with the skills, with the equipment. Schools are equipped also, and teachers are trained so that anybody and everybody can access a good education. These are some of the examples of what we do in order to promote and support educational equity, Ayesha.
Sampurasun Ibu Valerie, izin bertanya, kumaha kontribusi PBB ngaronjatkeun partisipasi pemuda, sangkan pemuda teh tiasa mastikeun sagala pengambilan keputusan teh inklusif, responsif, partisipatif, jeung representatif dina sagala tingkatan.
Rampes Diaz, and thank you for your question. Actually, youth participation and engagement is so important. But first, you have to know where are the gaps, you know? So I would say one of the first approach that we have as UN is really to acknowledge and identify the gaps. And to this end, you have to know that the UN has a huge work in advocacy in order to acknowledge those gaps. You know, the UN has a voice. I mean, you know, we often say the UN is the voice of the voiceless. So the UN has a voice, and we use it to speak up when needed, to discuss with the government, to research the gaps and the problems, and to report on that. So that's one of the first, I would say, component of our work, to use our voice to acknowledge, identify, and report on the gaps and the needs of the youth. Now, there is another type of activity we have in order to make sure that youth can participate in the decisions that impact their lives. It's to equip them through a direct capacity building, but also through the establishment of platforms where they can engage with the government. This dialogue between youth and government is very essential, but it has to be done in such a way that youth know how to engage, are trained to engage, and this is also part of the work that we do. Now, we also make sure that youth participate in important events or activities that will have an impact on the decisions that impact their lives. The Voluntary National Review for the Sustainable Development One is one of these reviews where we make sure that youth are engaged. Another one is the Universal Periodic Review on Human Rights. This is a review that is being done every 5 years, and we make sure as well that youth participate in that so that they can bring their consideration, their problem, and be the ones addressing and proposing some solution. Another aspect of the work that we do as UN on those issues is to focus on the digital divide. Nowadays, everything is e-something. Actually, if you want to access health, you have e-health, you have e-education, you have e-banking, you have e-industry. Everything is e-something. So to not have access to internet, to not possess a computer, or to not have access to one, to not know how to use it, these are some of the biggest impediments to many activities. And this is also where the UN is working very closely with government, with civil society, and with youth group in order to address this digital divide. Now, there is also the social, educational, and economic empowerment that is so critical for an active and meaningful participation in decision making. You know, youth have to be at the table as women, have to be at the table, but they have to be there with a voice and a loud one. But we must have also ears listening to them. And that's why we also work with the government to make sure that whatever we identify among the youth is brought to the government. And we work also with the government to make sure that the laws and the policies and the strategies and the plans of action do take into consideration the rights of the youth, their expectations, and their needs. These are some examples of what the UN does in order to make sure that the youth can contribute, participate into the decision and the processes that impact their life, and to make sure that whatever is done in Indonesia, that it is done in an inclusive manner, as you asked. Thank you very much, Dias.
Halo Bu Valerie, menurut pendapat Ibu, tantangan apa yang dihadapi oleh para profesional muda dalam karirnya setelah pandemi? Apakah PBB telah memetakan tantangan tersebut? Apabila sudah, apakah tantangan di Indonesia berbeda dengan tantangan yang dihadapi profesional muda di negara lain?
Okay, so hello, Dominique. It's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for your question about the challenge of the young professional and what the UN does, and are they different, those challenges, from the children, the challenges of other youth in other countries? First of all, I must say the big challenge that we see today is that the pandemic has seriously impacted the countries of the world. And it's interesting to see that, unlike other issues, COVID is certainly the most democratic one that we can see, because rich and poor countries have been affected. The fact that you are rich does not protect you necessarily against COVID. So that's one important component, is that COVID has impacted all the countries of the world, so that when it comes to the young professional, whether you are a young professional in a rich country or in a poor country, you could not escape to the impact of COVID. And one of the big impacts of COVID is that it has increased unemployment. And among those unemployed, the young professionals are the ones who have been the most affected. They have been affected by job shortages, by the loss in income and revenue. But especially they have been more affected than the rest, mostly because prior to the pandemic, youth unemployment was actually higher than overall unemployment. If you take the situation in Indonesia, for instance, youth unemployment rate in Indonesia before the pandemic was 5 to 6 times higher than that of adult. And it is actually the highest in the Southeast Asia region. Add to that such a big society, every year there is about 2.5 million new entrants on the labor market, mostly youth. So considering all those new entrants, youth in the labor market, on the labor market, then take the ones who have lost their job. This represents a very, very difficult situation for the young professional. And in all that, as always, youth and women have been the most affected. And why? Because also youth and women are more likely to be working in those sectors that have been most affected, such as retail, accommodation, food services. And you know, when a company has to cut job, which job do you think they cut first? Well, the ones of the young people. You know, because it goes with the logic that, well, then they have time to find another job, whereas the older people have to stay on the job because they have to sustain a family. So all those reasons make that the situation of COVID has severely impacted the youth. And in that, as I said, women have been particularly affected. You know, actually, women have been also very much affected because COVID has also created the need for more home care, for more attending the sick at home. And guess who stays at home? Mostly women. Add to that 70% of the workers in the health and social sectors are women, and there you go. So you can see that the young professional, and among them the young women professional, have been very much affected. And women also do 4 times more unpaid care work as men. So when the health system is overburdened, then the greater burden is placed on the women, that they have to stay at home and care for the sick. So in order to address the situation, we must focus on a number of activities. And one of them is actually the reskilling or the adjustment to the rapid changes in the labor market. I was mentioning the issue of the digital divide. And the digital divide is so important. We must reskill the people so that they can adjust to a system of work that has now generated, a situation that has now generated much more e-commerce. Did you see it with COVID? How much now services do we have online, even more so than before? The e-commerce present opportunities for the youth. Because you see, this is where the youth have an advantage. There is something positive in being young in that context, is that youth are more flexible and faster at acquiring new skills and to establish startups. We have seen actually during COVID, how many new startups have started, and these were led by youth. So what we do as UN is that we are supporting the youth, we are supporting the women, so that they can really enter these new areas of work. Another area of work for us as UN, it has also been and continue to be to safeguard and to leverage the gains that were done before the pandemic, that we make sure that we safeguard them now, during the pandemic and after the pandemic, and particularly when it comes to gender equality and women empowerment. There has been some progress, but during the pandemic time, we have been going backwards. More violence, more restriction on women. So we work on preserving that, on making sure that as soon as the situation allows for it, we go back to the point where we were before and we continue to grow. And finally, one big aspect of the work of the UN during this, and this is interesting because this has been done in all countries, was to expand the social protection system. Many countries, including in mine, that is quite developed when it comes to social protection, we had to expand the social protection support, expand it to more people because the pandemic has really impacted different groups that were not necessarily impacted before by other situations. So to expand the number of people, but also to expand the type of support that is being provided to people. So social protection in all its expression, it's also an area of work where the UN has been working very closely with the government, and the government has actually put in place a number of social protection networks and systems to help the people during the pandemic. So what I want to say through all those examples is that, of course, poorer countries have been impacted by many other elements, like having limited health capacity to respond to the crisis. We see that there has been a vaccine drops in some countries due to a lack of solidarity. But in general, COVID has impacted everybody. So the youth of Indonesia have been impacted as the youth in my country or the youth in other countries. But here in Indonesia, we have been focusing on those aspects that I have mentioned. But what I'm very hopeful is to see that there is a very enthusiastic youth in Indonesia, very creative. It's amazing to see how much the youth in Indonesia actually are ingenious and creating new activities. So I'm hopeful that the youth of Indonesia will be actually the engine for the economic recovery post-COVID. Thank you very much, Dominique.